Let's now talk about arrow functions, which are yet another very cool addition to JavaScript. So suppose that we have an array with a couple of birth years and that we want to calculate the age for each of these years. So basically we would have const years. Okay, remember that whenever we have a value or a variable that's not going to change over time, we use the const to declare that variable. And in this case, this is totally the case. So just some random years here, 1982, and let's say 1937. Okay, so remember we can use the map method to loop over the array and then do some stuff with it. And that's how we do it in ES5. So again we start with ES5 here and then move on to ES6. So in ES6 we would use var to declare a variable, right? So ages, and I'm going to call it ages5 because it's for ES5. And now we can say years.map, and you remember all of this, right? So we have our callback function here, and then our code inside of this callback function. And remember that here in the map method, we have access to the current element, the current index, and also the entire years array. So I'm just going to call it L, which stands for element here, okay? And if we then return something here, which will be 2016 minus the element in this case, it then gets stored into this array that we specified here. So this is how the map method works. So nothing new in here. Let's just simply console.log this array so that we can see that everything works. Alright, so these are the 4 ages. Now in ES6 we have a more beautiful and quicker way of writing this part here of the code. So this callback function. So let me show you how. ES6. So now I use the const keyword and I call it ages6 years.map, and now comes the difference. So now we can use an arrow function. And how does the arrow function work in this case? Well, it's just like this. Element, then the arrow function 2016 minus the element. And that's it. So let me explain it to you. So here we have the argument, here we have the arrow operator, and then here we have what we have here in the return statement. So this one here is going to produce the exact same thing as all of this piece of code up here. So for a simple callback function like this here with only one argument, it really is as simple as this. So there's no function keyword, no return keyword, no parentheses, nor curly braces. All we need is the argument, the arrow, and then what we have in our return statement. So it really is as simple as this. And you see how much easier it is for us to write code like this, right? So we have to write a lot less code. Just to make sure, let's also log this one, just to show you that it really worked. And here it is. So it produces the exact same result, and we write a lot less code. Now, if we have more than one argument here, we actually have to provide the parentheses. So let me show you an example of that. So ages6. And now remember, we cannot change a constant, right? So let's change it here to let. All right, and so now it's a normal variable that we can mutate as we want. And let's now write it in a different way. So years.map. And once again, remember that we have access to the current element, the current index, and the array itself. So now I want to access the element and also the index. And so I have 2 arguments. And so, as I said before, I now have to use these parentheses here. So element and index. And then let's use the knowledge that we gained before in the last lecture, which are these template literals. So we're going to put a string in here saying age element index, or actually index plus 1, why not, is simply, and remember that in here we can even have expressions like this, so like 2016 minus the element, and so that's it. So now we used 2 arguments here, and therefore we had to use these parentheses here. Okay, let's just console.log ages again. So age element 1, age element 2, 3, and 4. So that's the small change that we have to do when we have 2 arguments. Now if we have more than 1 line here in this return part here, let's say, actually it's just this one here. So if we have more than this line, we also have to use the curly braces that we have to use in normal functions. And also the return keyword is then not implicit, and we have to write it again. So let's see an example of that as well. And I'm gonna call it ages6 again, because why create new variables here, right? So again, the same arguments, and I skip the parentheses here. All right, and again, I want more than 1 line of code, and therefore I need to use these curly braces. So let's create a variable here, which is the current year, all right, so that it makes sense that we have more than 1 line. And I'm sure that you know by now how to get the current year, because we did this in our project. All right, and we can also calculate the age here outside. So let's say now minus the current element, and then let me return the string that we had before. So this one here. And remember that in this case, I actually have to write out the return statement here, the return keyword. Now here I want age, and that's it. Okay. And here we go. So it worked again. So there are 3 ways of writing arrow functions. The first one is with 1 argument in 1 line of code, and that's the simplest form. If we then add another argument, we need to use the parentheses. And if we then add more lines of code, more than 1, then we have to use the curly braces and the return keyword at the end. All right, so this is how arrow functions work. And I'm absolutely sure that you see how useful they can be, right? But there's even more to arrow functions. That's not all. So let's move on now to the next lecture to learn all about it.